The first discovery at a Texas motel. It was a cold, dreary March evening in 1998, the kind of night that blankets Houston with a relentless drizzle and an air of unease. For Linda Grayson, a housekeeper at the Sunshine Inn, this was just another late shift. The motel wasn't known for its luxury, rather its affordability, attracting truckers, transient workers, and the occasional drifter. But Linda had seen it all in her 10 years working there, or so she thought. Room 215 had been on her cleaning list for the evening. The guest, a man who checked in under the name Richard Walker, hadn't requested any service for over 2 days, and the motel's policy required someone to check on him. Linda sighed as she grabbed the master key, juggling her cleaning supplies and flashlight. Something about the quietness of the hallway felt off. Upon reaching room 215, Linda knocked once, then twice, no response. She leaned her ear against the door, listening for any music, TV noise, or movement, but nothing. Finally she called out, "Mr. Walker? Housekeeping, I'm coming in, all right?" The old door creaked ajar, and what greeted Linda would haunt her for years to come. The pungent stench of decay seeped out, nearly knocking her back. "God almighty," she whispered, pulling her sleeve over her nose. The room was oddly neat at first glance, the bed made, a suitcase tucked against the wall. But then her eyes drifted to the dark red stains smeared across the carpet leading to the bathroom. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hesitantly stepped forward, her shoes sticking slightly to the tacky residue on the floor. When she pushed open the bathroom door, her blood turned to ice. There, slumped over the bathtub, was what remained of the guest. Richard Walker's lifeless body was contorted in a grotesque position. His shirt was soaked in blood, revealing deep stab wounds that left a ghastly pattern across his chest. There was no doubt about it. This wasn't an accident. Linda dropped the cleaning supplies with a loud clatter and staggered out of the room, nearly tripping over herself as she rushed back towards the front office. "Call the police! Now!" she screamed to the desk clerk, her voice trembling with terror. The Houston Police Department arrived swiftly, the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness outside the motel. Detective Frank Walters, a seasoned investigator accustomed to grisly crime scenes, took charge. As he walked into room 215, he scanned every corner with sharp, calculating eyes. "Doesn't look like a robbery," Walters remarked, as his partner, Detective Sandra Miller, began taking photos of the room. The guest's wallet, along with any form of identification, was missing, but his suitcase remained untouched. The cash register downstairs wasn't tampered with either. Whoever did this, they wanted him dead, plain and simple. The bathroom told a story of struggle. Marks on the walls suggested the victim had fought back, but there were no signs of defensive wounds on his hands. Walters knelt down beside the victim's body, noting the precise nature of the stab wounds. "This wasn't a frenzied attack," he muttered. "These are deliberate, aimed strikes. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." The search for clues seemed fruitless. No weapon at the scene, no footprints in or out, as if the killer had simply vaporized after the act. Even the bloodstains, though plentiful, were limited to the immediate vicinity. Miller sighed. He wiped everything clean. No prints on the sink, no hair, no fibers. Whoever this is, they've done this before. By the next morning, the motel was swarming with forensic teams, curious onlookers kept at bay by yellow police tape. Yet for all the commotion, the lack of leads left Walters deeply unsettled. Motel murders weren't unheard of, but this was something else. This killer wasn't sloppy, they weren't driven by desperation. This, Walters whispered to himself as he watched the coroner wheel the body out, was just the beginning. The killer's profile slowly emerges. 2 weeks had passed since the murder of Richard Walker in Houston. Detectives Frank Walters and Sandra Miller had spent those days poring over surveillance videos, financial records, and interview transcripts. Despite their best efforts, every lead hit a dead end. It was as if the killer moved in the shadows, careful and calculated. Then, a call came in from Dallas. "A dead woman at the Backroad Motel," said the voice of Detective Ramirez on the other end of the phone. "Crime scene's messy, but get this. A trucker found her in her room and reported cash, Idaho, and credit cards all missing. Sound familiar?" Walters tightened his grip on the receiver. "Like deja vu, we're on our way." The Backroad Motel in Dallas was the picture of desolation. A worn-out neon sign flickered at the entrance, while faded doors lined the dimly lit courtyard. Room 129 was cordoned off with yellow tape as Walters and Miller weaved past investigators and onlookers. Inside, the room reeked of iron and bleach. Alicia Parker, the victim, lay sprawled on the bed, her neck bruised with clear signs of strangulation. The sheets were rumpled, a sharp contrast to Walker's meticulously staged death. Walters stood in the middle of the room, scanning the chaos. "Different method," he murmured, "but same pattern of precision. No ID, no cash, no fingerprints, just like Houston." Miller crouched near the bed, pointing. "There's a blood smear on the bedpost, almost like he checked for a pulse and smeared his hand against the wood. And look at her earrings." "What about them?" "She's wearing them." Walters frowned. "So, it's not about valuables, he doesn't take jewelry, it's about control. Messy kills but keeps the rooms clean otherwise, almost obsessive." As they examined the room, Ramirez entered, holding up a motel registration card. "Here's our guy's alias this time, Daniel Grayson. Paid cash up front, fake ID, no car license plate spotted, another ghost." Walters rubbed his temples. "Fake names, cash only, no digital footprint. This doesn't feel random, it's too planned, calculated even." Back at the Dallas precinct, a profiler from the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit joined their meeting. He clicked through images of both crime scenes, Houston and Dallas. "Richard Walker in room 215, Alicia Parker in room 129, the profiler began, pointing at side-by-side photos. "Here's what we know. Both victims were solo travelers, late check-ins. No noise from the rooms reported during their stays. The killer chooses secluded motels off the highway, places with minimal surveillance. This isn't his first time." Miller folded her arms, leaning against the table. "What are you saying? We've got a serial killer roaming the highways?" The profiler nodded. "Exactly. He's refining his craft. First victim in Houston, stabbed with precision. The second, strangled but still methodical. He's adaptable. This is someone who's comfortable asserting dominance. Likely male, mid-30s to mid-40s, transient lifestyle. He avoids anything that leaves a trace. Cash only, disposable IDs. My guess? He's traveling in a nondescript vehicle, something that blends in like a truck or older model car." Walters crossed his arms, pacing. "So what does he want? What's driving him?" "The killing itself," the profiler replied solemnly. "This isn't about money. Sure, he takes ID and cash, but that's secondary. Probably just covers his tracks or funds his movement. This is about asserting control over the victims. He's driven by anger, though not a frenzied type. He's careful, composed, and he's learning from every kill." Miller leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "We've got 2 victims in Texas, weeks apart. Think we're looking at someone working their way cross-country?" "Given the time gap," the profiler said, "I do. He travels, likely works in short stints or gig jobs that let him stay under the radar. My bet? This guy's a trucker or a seasonal laborer. He lives a solitary, unsettled lifestyle, which makes his movements unpredictable." Just as the team regrouped to strategize, an officer burst into the room. "Got something you'll want to see. CCTV footage from a gas station near the Backroad Motel." All eyes turned to the grainy footage on the monitor. A tall man, average build, wearing a dark hoodie and faded jeans, bought a pack of cigarettes and a 6-pack of beer. He kept his head low, a baseball cap shielding most of his face. "Time's 9:03 p.m., the officer explained. "That's about 3 hours before Alicia was killed." Miller leaned closer to the monitor. "Do we have his car?" "Unfortunately, no plate number, but the clerk said he drove a silver pickup. Could be nothing, could be everything." Walters exhaled deeply. "Let's add him to the bolo. Hoodie, cap, silver pickup. Not a lot to work with, but let's start connecting the dots. If he's moving along I-35 or I-10, we might have some luck catching up." As Miller and Walters left the precinct that night, the implications weighed heavily on them. This wasn't just Houston or Dallas, it could be anywhere. Who else was out there in shadowed motel rooms, unknowingly awaiting the killer's arrival? "This guy," Walters muttered, just loud enough for Miller to hear. "He's not stopping anytime soon, and the bigger his confidence gets, the worse this is gonna end." Each case was different yet equally terrifying. The string of murders stretched like a ghostly thread across Texas and the surrounding states, leaving a trail of whispers and unanswered questions behind. Detective Walters leaned over the map pinned to the wall in the precinct's investigation room, his fingers running along the spaghetti tangle of highways connecting neighboring states, Texas, Louisiana, and New Mexico. Each red pin stabbed into the map represented a new victim, a new body. The pattern haunted them, and yet it never made sense. Miller entered the room holding a thick case file. "Frank, you need to see this," she said, dropping the stack of reports on the table with a dull thud. "What's this?" Walters asked, his tired eyes lifting from the map. "A breakdown of crime scene specifics. Every single case we've attributed to this guy. The thing is, they're all different. I mean really different." "Different how?" Walters waved a hand for her to explain, motioning her to sit down. She flipped open the report and pulled out photo after photo, arranging them in a deliberate line across the table. Look at this. Houston. Stab wounds clean, precision strikes practically surgical. He nodded, remembering the scene vividly. That's Walker, scene was meticulous. No personal touches, just efficient. Miller tapped the next photo. Dallas, strangulation, total mess, furniture overturned, bed unmade and blood on the walls, almost feels personal. And Parker, Walters muttered, shaking his head. I can still see the marks on her neck. She moved to the next file. Then we've got Louisiana. Motel room just outside Shreveport. Blunt force trauma, guy's skull caved in with what looks like a tire iron. Blood smears everywhere. Walters let out a low whistle. Okay, now that breaks the pattern. Exactly, Miller said, pointing to more photos. The weapon changes, the conditions at the scene change. The victims barely have anything in common except being alone and traveling. Walters studied the lineup silently for a moment. The transition from strangulation to blunt force was jarring. The stab wound seemed cold and calculated, while the blunt force was raw, almost as if the killer had let frustration leak into his work. Then strangulation, intimate and violent. These were the marks of someone trying to send different messages, or maybe messages no one could yet decipher. So, what are we looking at here, Sandra? A serial killer with an identity crisis, or are we sure this is the same guy? Walters finally asked, his voice heavy. Miller exhaled sharply. That's just it. Ballistics or prints aren't leaving us breadcrumbs, Frank. Only the overall MO ties these together. Highway motels, solo travelers, and the same eerie precision with cleanup. No prints, no fiber, no hair. Hell, there's barely even dirt tracked into these rooms. Walters leaned back, rubbing his temples as if trying to will the details into alignment. Alright, let's play this out. Why the shift? Why go from clean surgical kills to brutal acts? Could he be losing it, getting sloppy? Or practicing, Miller offered, folding her arms as she leaned against the desk. Think about it. If you were a killer fine-tuning your craft but didn't care about witnesses or suspicion, wouldn't you experiment? See what works, what doesn't, for the thrill of it? Walters grimaced, though it wasn't hard to believe. Imagine the kind of psyche you'd have to carry to live like that, living off stolen cash and identities, dealing blows to random strangers. His tone sharpened as he turned in his chair. But there's another possibility. Go on, Miller prompted. Maybe the difference is they're not mistakes or experiments, Walters said slowly, thinking it through as he spoke. What if they're intentional? I mean, think about it. Body stabbed neatly, then the next one strangled with bed sheets, and then the next smashed with a blunt instrument. It's throwing us off the trail. He knows just enough about investigation techniques to avoid creating a predictable pattern. Like he's deliberately confusing the profiles, Miller muttered, the wheels in her mind spinning visibly. Make it seem like multiple killers, different weapons, different styles. And then cops in Houston, Dallas, or Louisiana don't connect the dots. Walters finished for her. Half of these small-town departments wouldn't even flag the cases. Miller picked up another file, her expression grim. This one's worse, Frank. Roswell, New Mexico, a woman traveling alone, backpacker type. She wasn't even found in a motel. She was dumped in a drainage ditch 2 miles off the main highway. Cause of death? Multiple stab wounds. But there's no blade on Earth sharp enough to explain the puncture marks. From the pattern, it almost looks like... She hesitated, allowing Walters to glower skeptically. Like what, Sandra? Something industrial, maybe a railroad spike or... God, I don't know, some kind of tool. My point is, he's not picking from convenience anymore. He's branching out. That makes 4 states, Walters grunted, counting aloud before walking toward the board to check the migration trail. New Mexico, Louisiana, Texas. But then what are the odds he sticks close to this one area? Should we be looking wider? Hell yeah, we should, Walters barked with rising irritation. This guy's a damn phantom, and the spread? He tapped the pinned states hard. The spread is too clean. No fanned routes outside interstates and interchanges, all within goddamn trucking lanes. Miller leaned back, crossing her arms. She smirked bitterly. Trucker. That profiler might have been onto something. And that means he's mobile, Walters added, frustration folding into exhaustion. He could be killing in Michigan by now, for Christ's sake. A hollow silence lingered in the dim room, the corkboard glowing faint under the fluorescent light. For the first time, both detectives felt like even luck wouldn't catch up with their suspect. He was somewhere out there, another highway, another faceless town, and another disposable victim. Finally, Miller broke the silence. What about the victim spread? Male, female, young, old? There's no rhyme or reason here. Walters squinted. No obvious links, yeah, but he still sticks to travelers. If there's a reason for that, something specific, then we've got to find it. He jabbed at the air as if accusing the wall of its own neglect. Someone out there knows what drives this lunatic. This narrative style was crafted to heighten the tension and display the struggle of piecing together fragmented crime details. It situates the reader alongside the detectives as every new sinister detail emerges. Let me know how it lands for you, or if you'd like to explore deeper into any of the killer's behavioral nuances. Suspicions from fake identities. Detective Sandra Miller sat at her desk, her fingers drumming anxiously on the keyboard as she stared at the digital trail, or lack thereof. "Frank, get over here," she called out, her voice tight with frustration. Detective Frank Walters shuffled over, holding his cup of lukewarm coffee. "What now? Another dead end?" he asked, sliding into the chair next to her. "Basically." Miller waved at the screen where a scanned driver's license filled the display. "Look at this guy, Daniel Grayson, a quiet, unassuming man born in Oakland, California, except he doesn't exist." Walters leaned closer, obvious fatigue weighing down his usually sharp eyes. "You're saying the ID's fake?" Miller nodded firmly. "Not just fake, Frank, it's practically professional. The laminate, the holograms, it's the kind of forgery you don't find from someone cutting corners at a flea market. There's zero discrepancies in the barcode, signature formatting, or registration. It's good enough to slip past motel clerks or even some state checkpoints. Except, and here's the gotcha, the ID number doesn't check out in any database." Walters swirled his coffee, letting out a low whistle. "Huh. Whoever made it knows what they're doing. And he's not using just one of these, is he?" "Oh no," Miller snorted angrily, opening another file on her screen. "Richard Walker, Daniel Grayson, Timothy Clark, that's just the short list. He has an entire toolbox of these identities. Different names, different states of origin, but all disposable identities he uses to vanish after every crime." Walters leaned back and crossed his arms, soaking in the implications. "So, let's map it out. Step 1. He uses these IDs to check into motels under an alias. Cash only. No cards, no paper trail, no bartender memories or pick-me-up receipts. He stays off radar until..." He gestured vaguely in the air. "Until he decides to make his move. And then," Miller interjected, her tone serious, "he takes the only identity that matters, the victim's. That's how he keeps moving so easily. We've got reports of multiple stolen driver's licenses showing up in states hundreds of miles from their original owners' deaths." Walters frowned, tapped his fingers against the desk, then said, "Yeah. We saw Walker's ID ping in New Mexico, 2 days after he was found dead in Houston?" "Exactly," Miller replied, her brows furrowing as she pulled up another connection. "And Alicia Parker's credit card was swiped at a mom-and-pop diner in Oklahoma 48 hours after her body was discovered. The damn waitress said the guy even left a 15% tip." Walter's jaw tightened. "Brazen SOB. "Brazen and smart," Miller agreed. "He's cycling these identities, some for hours, some for a day or two tops, but he always ditches them before they lead back to him. He's actively wiping his trail clean at every stop while also funding his travel. Look at this." She pulled up a recent report. "Here's where it gets messier. Timothy Clark's ID turned up in Amarillo, but get this. He wasn't a murder victim. His wallet was actually stolen months before from a parking lot at Yellowstone." Walters straightened. "So he's not just relying on his immediate victims. He's collecting identities, stolen IDs, building his own damn Rolodex of aliases. And that's not even the worst part," Miller added grimly. "Every ID he grabs gets more time bought. We run these aliases after the fact, sure, but it's like chasing smoke. The problem is the bigger picture. This guy's not just jumping across states, he's operating like..." She paused, searching for the words. "Like a fugitive network by himself," Walters finished for her, his tone heavy as the weight of realization settled between them. Miller sighed, shooting him a glance. "Yeah, except he doesn't just hide, he kills, Frank, but he uses these identities like playing cards. Dealt out, discarded and exchanged on a whim, and every time he swaps them we lose more ground." Walters took a large gulp of his now cold coffee, setting the cup down heavily. "So where the hell is he getting these IDs? No way this guy is personally lifting wallets from every victim or carjacking random tourists in Yellowstone one week and strangling a woman in Dallas the next." "That's what I'm stuck on," Miller admitted, staring hard at one of the screens. "If he's this clean, this disciplined, he's not sloppy enough to make his own IDs in a motel room. He has to have someone, an accomplice maybe, someone who specializes in high-level forgery." "You think there's an underground market for this?" Walters asked skeptically. Miller shrugged but nodded slowly. "Maybe. There are reports of identity brokers working out of places like Vegas. Or even back-of-van operations in parking lots near big truck stops. Guys who sell bundles of fake IDs for cash. It's all about mobility with these networks, staying out of reach. And think about it, this guy's nailed mobility. Walters rubbed his chin, deep in thought. Okay, step 1, we run a sweep. Vegas, Arizona, New Mexico. Find where these forgeries are getting churned out. But step 2. He paused, locking eyes with Miller. You think he's using stolen IDs as bait too? Like cycling the heat off himself? Miller pursed her lips. You mean, leaving victim ID cards in places that mislead us just to watch us chase ghosts? Why not? He's already proven 3 things. He's smart, unpredictable, and loves control. Setting us up to waste time checking dead ends could be exactly how he gets the thrill of staying ahead. A frustrated silence filled the room as they stared at maps cluttered with pins and case files overflowing with missed leads. It was Miller who eventually broke it with a grim chuckle. You know, when I signed up for the Bureau, I thought the bad guys would at least have the decency to play by some kind of rules. Walters shook his head with a dry laugh. Sandra, you've been on this job long enough to know better. This one? He's not just breaking the rules, he's rewriting the damn book. This deep exploration into the killer's reliance on fake identities fleshes out the psychological games he's playing and how methodical and complex his operation truly is. It also highlights the challenges investigators face, creating suspense and mounting pressure as they try to pull apart his careful web. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or adjust the tone. Tracing the killer's steps. The Houston precinct's lights buzzed overhead as Detective Frank Walters furrowed his brow, staring at the mess of maps and crime reports strewn across the room. Every highway was starting to blur together. Every pin in the map represented another dead traveler. You know what kills me, Sandra? Walters muttered, holding an unlit cigarette he was too stressed to even light. It's not that he's doing this, it's that he's doing it so damn clean. This guy's like smoke. We can see where he's been, sure, but there's no touch, no trace. Like, we're following a ghost who knows what we'll do before we do it. Detective Sandra Miller didn't bother looking up from her laptop. There's got to be something he's missing. Nobody's perfect, Frank. Nobody. What about the last stop in Flagstaff? The Arizona case? Walters frowned, turning to the whiteboard behind him, where a scrawled timeline of dates and locations blinked back at him accusingly. What about it? Same pattern. Victim checks in alone, leaves horizontal in 3 days. Local PD went over the place twice. Nothing. No fingerprints, no fibers. He jabbed his finger into the photo of yet another highway motel. And the bastard even paid in cash again. But why Flagstaff? She pushed, pulling up the files. If he's bouncing between Texas, Louisiana, and New Mexico, why hop over to Arizona? What makes that place different? Walters paused, staring at the board. You think the location matters to him? Everything else he does is deliberate, Miller countered. The cleanup, the IDs, the weapon of choice. Hell, even when he decides to leave. There has to be something about how he's choosing his routes. They stared at the map in silence for a minute before Miller walked over, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She grabbed a marker and began circling the pins one by one. Houston, Dallas, Shreveport, then Flagstaff. A line began to emerge as she worked it backward. These motels, Miller said, tilting her head, they're all within a few miles of major truck stops, gas stations, or interchanges. Yeah, maybe it's randomness, or maybe the highways themselves are part of his plan. Walters rubbed his chin, the hint of realization settling in. Truck lanes, he said, his voice growing sharper. All these places, they're along major freight corridors. Miller snapped her fingers. Exactly. Think about it, Frank. He's not picking these towns because he's sentimental about them. He's using them because they're convenient. Stop, rest, kill, and roll out before anyone notices. A motel on the outskirts means less traffic, fewer cameras, no nosy neighbors. And if he's using a truck or a long-haul vehicle, he's invisible once he's on the move. All right, Walters muttered, picking up a pen. Let's connect some dots here. If he's sticking to corridors and these are his known spots, where the hell's he headed next? Miller flipped through the reports of sightings and stolen IDs. Flagstaff was his last confirmed crime. That was, 2 weeks ago? Based on his pattern, he doesn't normally wait this long. Spooked? Walters asked, scratching the back of his neck. Think he knows we're closing in? He's way too calculated, she replied. Spooked killers make mistakes. They rush and get sloppy. This guy isn't rushing anywhere, but he's not pausing for a vacation either. If we're following truck lanes, we need to think like a driver. Where can you hit next with a fast turnaround? Somewhere small, somewhere forgettable. Amarillo, Walters said after a pause, pointing at a red pin in Texas. If he's working I-40, that's his next logical stop, but that's a big if, Sandra. What if he doubles back to I-10 like he did 2 months ago? then it's New Mexico, or even El Paso. It's a risk, Miller admitted, pulling open a new laptop tab. But if we move fast enough, we might be able to put a warning ahead of him along the route. Get local police scanning for anything unusual, CCTV near truck stops, motel registries, silver pickup, alias names, cash payments. Walters shook his head. We tried that already. Guy's too careful. We need to focus in tighter, bait him somehow. The room fell into a heavy silence until Miller spoke. What if we followed the money? Walter's eyes narrowed. He doesn't use cards, Sandra. Guy's allergic to banks. No, she clarified, scrolling through flagged transactions. I mean from the victims, their credit cards, their stolen cash. There's always a trail somewhere. He's got to pawn their IDs or valuables at some point, or trade them in places we can track. If we overlap the timelines between deaths and stolen IDs used after, we might find a pattern in where he moves next. Walters watched her work, nodding gradually at the screen. That's not bad. So, if we assume every ID gives him a safe window of, say, 48 hours, then he's got to be running out of his last set by now. Exactly. Miller's fingers flew across the keyboard. If Flagstaff pushed him west, he could be pivoting to California by now, but if he swung east, the IDs might show up in small-town pawnshops along I-20. Walters leaned over, his voice dropping lower. And if we catch someone selling those IDs, maybe we don't just catch the next fake name, maybe we catch him. Miller's phone buzzed before she could reply. She picked it up, listening for a moment, then turned to Walters with wide eyes. Local PD in Amarillo just found an ID from the Flagstaff victim, used last night at a truck stop diner. Walters didn't wait for her to finish. Sandra, grab your coat. We've got ground to cover. As the two detectives walked out into the buzzing chaos of the precinct, the weight of possibility settled between them. They finally had a lead to follow, but they both knew it could just as easily unravel into another dead end, or worse, another victim waiting to be found in yet another nameless motel room. Walters pulled the door open and glanced back. This guy's been 10 steps ahead this whole damn time. Let's make sure this time, we're not playing catch-up. This expanded scene builds tension while showcasing the strategic thinking and mounting frustration behind the investigation. It's all about connecting the dots, moving with urgency, and the ever-present feeling of chasing someone far too clever. Let me know if you'd like this to go deeper or shift the tone. The case in Arizona that shocked everyone. It was August 1999, and the sun bore down relentlessly over the quiet town of Flagstaff, Arizona. Nestled beneath the shadows of the San Francisco peaks, Flagstaff wasn't the kind of place that made the nightly news. It was postcard perfect, with pine forests, historic streets, and a pace of life that seemed to belong to another era. But all of that changed one weekend when a local deputy stumbled across a cabin in the woods, a scene so grotesque that it shook even the most seasoned officers in the state. Detectives Frank Walters and Sandra Miller, now fully involved in tracking the highway killer, received the call late on a Friday evening. "Frank," Miller said as she hung up the phone, her face pale. "We've got another one, Flagstaff, but this time it's different." "Different how?" Walters asked, not looking up from the bag of evidence on his desk. It had been a long week, and his patience was wearing thin. "It's not a motel this time." Miller's voice was edged in disbelief. "It's a cabin, a rental, and it's not one victim, it's 3. That got Walters' attention. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he studied her. 3? You telling me our guy just did more damage in one night than he's done in over a year?" "I don't know, Frank," Miller admitted, slinging her coat over her shoulder. "But we need to find out. They're flying us out at first light." By the time they arrived at the Arizona crime scene, the air smelled of pine sap and something far less pleasant. A line of police tape cut through the forest, and uniformed officers stood solemnly outside the small wooden cabin. Its rustic charm had dissolved, now tainted with the weight of what was found inside. Walters stepped out of their unmarked car, slipping on a pair of sunglasses to shield his eyes from the blazing sun. "Goddamn heat," he muttered, adjusting his tie. "All right, Sandra, let's see what kind of horror show we're walking into." Captain Henry Neal of the Coconino County Sheriff's Department greeted them with a firm handshake and a grim expression. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice gravelly from years of cigar smoke. "You guys were right about the highway killer stretching his legs, but this isn't just another murder scene, this is a goddamn massacre." "What are we looking at?" Miller asked, skipping pleasantries. Neal gestured toward the cabin. "Family of 3, parents in their 30s, one boy 8 years old, Rented the place for a last-minute weekend getaway. Local caretaker found them this morning when he came by to check on a leaking water pipe. Poor bastard still throwing up behind the patrol car. Walters winced. And the cause of death? Neil's jaw tightened. You'll want to see it for yourselves. Inside the cabin, the scene was nothing short of horrifying. The smell hit first, thick, metallic, and raw. Flies buzzed furiously in the humid summer air. The living room was eerily intact, as if time had frozen mid-moment. A coffee pot still sat half-filled on the counter, a board game lay sprawled across the floor, but the details beyond it were enough to make Miller's stomach turn. The mother and father were found bound to the rustic wooden chairs in the kitchen, their throats slit with precision, blood pooling across the checkered linoleum. The boy's small body was crumpled in the corner near the fireplace, a baseball glove still hanging limply from his hand. Miller drew a sharp breath, glancing away for a moment to steady herself. Jesus Christ. Couldn't have said it better myself, Walters muttered, crouching near one of the chairs. Same MO as before, the bindings. He pointed to the knots on the father's hands and legs. Professionally tied, no struggle, he took his time. But why the kid? Miller asked, her voice strained. Our guy doesn't kill kids, he targets solo adults, this doesn't make sense. Neil spoke up from the doorway, his arms crossed. That's not the only irregularity. Coroner's already getting her initial notes back to us. She says the wounds on the parents match our killer's M.O. Sharp, deliberate, almost surgical. But the boy, his cause of death isn't consistent. What do you mean? Walters demanded, standing upright. Blunt force trauma, Neil explained, his eyes dark. They found a fireplace poker near the body, still covered in blood. Coroner thinks it was used to bash his skull in. It's rage. Pure, uncalculated rage. That's not him, Miller said immediately, shaking her head. The highway killer doesn't lose his cool. He doesn't get personal. This almost feels emotional, Walters finished for her, frowning deeply. And that's the problem. Has he escalated, or is this someone else entirely? Later that evening, Walters and Miller sat hunched over a table in the makeshift command post set up in the caretaker's small office. A spread of photos, notes, and timelines covered every inch of their workspace. The details didn't add up. We've always thought he picked his victims methodically, Miller said, rifling through their files. Solitary travelers, motels off the beaten path. But this, a family, in a cabin, that's not random. He's making a statement. Walters rubbed his temples, struggling to make sense of it. Maybe he's unhinged. Maybe we pushed him this far. The IDs, the heat from Flagstaff, the cops closing in. Could be he's cracking and getting sloppy. Or, Miller said, lowering her voice, this wasn't his plan. Think about it. A family, alive and enjoying their weekend. They wouldn't have fit his typical profile. What if they interrupted him? What if this wasn't planned at all? You're saying they just got in the way? Walters asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Maybe, Miller reasoned, leaning back in her chair. If he was hiding out here, scouting his next move, and they showed up unexpectedly, it could explain the rage, killing the boy, the messy scene. It's not his style because it wasn't supposed to happen this way. Walters sighed. If that's true, it means we've got a problem. A big one. He's escalated all right, but maybe not in the way we thought. He's not just hunting anymore, he's out of control. Outside, the Arizona night settled over the pine trees, quiet and oppressive. But for Walters and Miller, the silence carried a heavy weight. Somewhere the highway killer was already moving on, another identity in his pocket, another set of plans unfolding. The cabin in Flagstaff wasn't just another crime, it was a message, and it meant something dangerous. Their phantom wasn't sticking to the shadows anymore. What do you think of this expanded version? It builds suspense while layering in more about the killer's potential character and the detective's growing frustration. Let me know if you'd like me to dig deeper or make adjustments. A trap from a survivor. It was the call that changed everything. Sandra Miller answered her ringing desk phone one Tuesday afternoon with the same drained tone she'd carried for months. She expected another lead gone cold, another dead-end witness interview. What she didn't expect was the trembling voice of a woman on the other end of the line. "My name is Lisa Brown," the caller said, her voice shaky but determined. "I need to talk to you about the man who tried to kill me." Miller sat upright, gripping the receiver tighter. "Lisa, where are you calling from?" "Reno, Nevada," the woman answered. "I've been too scared to come forward, but when I saw the news about those highway murders, the photos of some of his victims, I knew it had to be the same man." Miller immediately motioned for Frank Walters, who rushed to her desk. Lisa, you're saying you survived an attack? Yes, Lisa whispered, audibly fighting back tears. He thought I was dead, but I wasn't, and I know what he looks like. 2 days later, Miller and Walters were sitting across from Lisa in a modest safe house on the outskirts of Reno. She looked tired, hollow even, like someone who hadn't truly felt safe in weeks, maybe years. Her blonde hair was tied away from her pale face, which bore fading bruises from a nightmare she could never quite leave behind. "Miss Brown," Walters said gently, leaning forward at the small kitchen table where they sat. "Tell us everything, from the beginning." Lisa nodded, clutching the warm mug of tea in her hands. "It was about 3 months ago. I was staying at this place off Highway 80, a motel, small, basic, the kind of place no one asks questions, you know. I had just gotten off a shift at one of the casinos in town. My friend Carla was supposed to meet me, but she canceled last minute, so I was alone." She paused, her eyes darting down to the table. Miller gave her a reassuring nod, urging her to continue. "This man, he was already at the motel when I checked in. I didn't think much about him at first. He looked normal. White guy, probably late 30s or early 40s, medium build. He wore a hoodie and a baseball cap, kept his head down. Nobody you'd give a second thought to, but something about the way he looked at me when I walked past his room like he was sizing me up, it gave me the creeps." Walters exchanged a glance with Miller. It fit the descriptions they'd pieced together from prior crime scenes. "Did he approach you?" Miller asked softly. Lisa nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, later that night I was outside smoking. He walked over, casual, asked to borrow a light. His voice was polite, friendly even. I thought maybe I'd misjudged him, until he started asking if I was there alone, if anyone knew I was staying there. My gut told me something was wrong, so I lied. I told him my boyfriend was coming by later." "What happened next?" Walters pressed, his voice quiet but firm. Lisa tightened her grip on the mug, her knuckles turning white. "I went back to my room, locked the door. Hours passed. I thought maybe I'd overreacted, but just after midnight, I heard the knob turn. Slowly. Like someone was testing it." Miller leaned forward. And that's when the door burst open. He must have picked the lock because there's no way he could have forced it so quietly. It happened so fast, he was on me before I could even scream." She was trembling now, the memories as raw as an open wound. "Take your time, Lisa," Walters said gently. Her voice cracked as she continued. "He hit me. Hard, over and over. I remember thinking, this is it, I'm gonna die here." He had a knife, long, sharp, but he didn't use it right away. He tied me up first, gagged me. Then... She hesitated, unable to finish the sentence. Miller broke the silence. "Lisa, that's enough. You don't have to relive every detail. The important thing is... you got away. How?" Lisa took a shaking breath, as if gathering every ounce of her remaining strength. "He thought I was unconscious, maybe dead. He'd tied me to the bed frame, but he made a mistake. He didn't check the knots well enough. Once he went to the bathroom, probably to clean up, I managed to loosen them. When he came back, I was behind the door. I hit him. With everything I had." "You hit him?" Walters asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. "There was a lamp on the nightstand," Lisa said, her voice growing steadier. "It wasn't much, but it was enough to knock him off balance. He stumbled, dropped the knife, and I ran. I didn't look back. I ran straight into the night." "When did the police arrive?" Miller asked. "Hours later," Lisa admitted. "By then, he was gone. I checked out of the hospital after only 1 day. I was too scared to stay. I thought he'd come back and finish the job if he found out I survived." By the time Lisa finished her account, the room was heavy with silence. Walters leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "This guy's escalating," he said finally, breaking the tension. "Motel break-ins, leaving survivors. It's messier than his usual M.O. He's getting either cocky or reckless." Miller ran a hand through her hair, her focus still on Lisa. "You said you saw his face. After the attack, do you think you'd be able to work with a sketch artist?" Lisa nodded, her determination returning. "Absolutely. I'll never forget his face." The next day, with Lisa's cooperation, a composite sketch was circulated across precincts in every state where the killer's crimes had been recorded. For the first time, Walters and Miller had more than just an alias or a set of fake IDs, they had a face. As Miller stapled a copy of the sketch to the board in their office, she turned to Walters. "You think this changes things?" Walters stared at the jagged lines of the drawing, a man with cold, haunting eyes beneath the shadow of a baseball cap. "Oh, it changes everything," he said. "Now we make it personal." This expanded section dives deep into Lisa's harrowing survival tale, adding vivid detail and emotion while emphasizing the significance of her testimony. The suspense is carefully built to tie her story to the detective's broader hunt for the killer. Let me know if it hits the mark or needs a new twist. The Federal Profile and the Trail of Terror. The room was quiet, save for the occasional shuffling of papers and the low hum of the projector flickering against the far wall. FBI agents, local detectives, and behavioral analysts sat in tense, focused silence around the large conference table inside Quantico's Behavioral Analysis Unit headquarters. On the screen, crime scene photos flashed one after another, faded motel signs, yellow police tape, lifeless bodies staged in hauntingly deliberate ways. Sandra Miller leaned forward, arms folded, an ever-deepening crease forming on her brow. Frank Walters sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the screen, his face unreadable. 14 dead, Special Agent Victoria Hayes began, her voice calm but precise, and that's just the ones we've confirmed. Over a span of nearly 2 years, this individual has managed to elude every jurisdiction he's operated in, leaving behind almost nothing to link the murders, except the highways. Hayes gestured to the electronic map behind her. Pins dotted the major highways that snaked through Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma. Intersections of interstates like I-10, I-35, and I-40 seemed to be frequent stopping points. 14 confirmed murders across 5 states, Hayes continued, but we suspect there could be more. Victims ranging from young adults to middle-aged travelers, both male and female, usually alone at the time of the attack. Their only commonality, they were all transient. Drivers, backpackers, people moving between one place and another, essentially, ghosts. Easy targets, Walters muttered, mostly to himself. Miller glanced at him but said nothing. She was too fixated on what Agent Hayes was saying. Before we dive into behavioral profiling, Hayes said, clicking to the next slide, I want to highlight the timeline. It's crucial to understanding his evolution. The screen displayed a series of mugshots, conflicting identities, and crime scene reports. The first confirmed victim, Richard Walker, was discovered in Houston, Texas, March 1998. Hayes clicked the remote. Alicia Parker, found 3 months later in Dallas. Then a gap of 5 months before a truck driver stumbled upon Caitlin Rhodes's body along a stretch of highway outside Shreveport, Louisiana. That gap, Miller interjected, finally speaking, it's longer than the others. Do we think he just stopped? Hayes shook her head. We think he was moving, perfecting his MO. Based on subsequent crimes, it's likely there are victims in that 5-month gap we simply haven't connected to him yet. He's extremely careful about choosing locations where there's minimal local law enforcement resources, and where transient victims might not garner much attention. Walters exhaled sharply. Jesus. So, while we're scrambling over flagged files, this guy's treating the highway system like some kind of goddamn hunting ground. The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of Walters' words set in. Hayes nodded solemnly. This is where the behavioral analysis comes in, Hayes said, turning to the next slide. We're not just looking at a killer, we're looking at a highly mobile predator, someone who is meticulous, calculated, and adaptive. Every kill is both controlled and specific to the environment. He's not leaving things to chance. Means he knows how to blend in, Miller said quietly. Exactly, Hayes replied. He's intimately familiar with the interstate network. He chooses motels, cabins, and truck stops on the outskirts of towns, places with minimal surveillance and transient guests. These are locations where law enforcement may not even realize they're dealing with a serial offender until it's long past his departure. Truck driver? Walters asked, sitting up straighter. Your profile said he might be in the long-haul industry. It's still our strongest working theory, Hayes responded, pulling up a slide labeled Occupational Profile. To operate with this level of precision across so many states, he would need a reason to be constantly traveling without drawing suspicion. A trucker's schedule would explain his ability to move freely and avoid detection while always having access to off-the-grid accommodations like truck stops. You think he's a loner? Miller asked. Almost definitely, Hayes said. Serial offenders of this nature rarely maintain stable family lives or close friendships. However, I will point out that we believe he's capable of mimicking emotional connection. It would explain why victims like Lisa Brown initially didn't feel threatened, and why unsuspecting clerks failed to remember him after interacting with him. A voice from across the room broke the momentary silence. What about the IDs, all those stolen identities? Hayes turned toward the young analyst sitting in the back of the room. The fake IDs are key. According to the timeline, he's been using 1 or 2 identities per crime, then discarding them entirely. We suspect he's sourcing them through an underground forgery network, possibly based near Las Vegas, though we're still working to confirm that lead. Smart, Walters muttered bitterly. Guy knows how to disappear. Hayes picked up on Walters' tone. He's not just disappearing, he's actively misleading. By the time an ID makes its way into our systems, he's miles ahead, operating under a new name. He's cycling these aliases to erase his trail, but here's what's interesting. She clicked to the next slide. Some of these IDs aren't just fakes. They're from real people, stolen from his victims. Which means he's not just hiding, he's testing us. Every time he tosses an ID into the system, we have to ask whether it's a breadcrumb or a red herring. So, what now? Walters asked, his voice rising with frustration. We know the guy's dangerous, careful, constantly moving. We know his methods, his routes, and hell, we even know he might be driving a plain silver pickup. But do we have anything actionable? We're no closer to catching him than we were 2 weeks ago. Actually, Hayes said with a hint of resolve, that's not entirely true. We've been able to cross-analyze Border Patrol data with flagged motel registrations. We don't have a name, we never do, but we have a pattern. Based on his typical cooldown periods and known travel routes, we believe his next stop is likely on I-40, near Albuquerque or Amarillo. Miller straightened. But if we know his next move, can't we get ahead of him, set up surveillance? We're working with state patrols and local departments to coordinate that exact effort, Hayes confirmed. But remember, he moves like a ghost. Getting ahead of him isn't as simple as just putting up cameras. If he so much as suspects there's heat on him, he'll change directions and vanish again. Walters leaned back in his chair, his lips pressing into a tight line. So we wait, we play his game. Again. No, Hayes said firmly, meeting his gaze. We don't just wait. We build his profile tighter than ever. The more we understand his patterns, the more we know who we're really chasing. And eventually, even ghosts make mistakes. The meeting ended in tense uncertainty. But as Miller and Walters left Quantico that evening, one thing was clear. This wasn't just another serial killer case. This was a hunt, a game of cat and mouse across the sprawling, desolate highways of the American West. And the killer? He wasn't just a step ahead. He was orchestrating the entire board. Do you believe it? Miller asked as they leaned against the hood of their car in the parking lot, staring toward the darkening horizon. Believe what? Walters asked, lighting his first cigarette in hours. That he'll slip up. That even he can't be perfect forever. Walters flicked the ash from his cigarette and gave her a sidelong glance. I don't believe anyone's perfect, Sandra. But this guy? He's about the closest I've ever seen. This expansion builds the tension while providing depth into the killer's methods and the mounting frustration of the investigation. It highlights the critical role of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the psychological profiling process, and how every small detail is part of the chilling hunt for a seemingly invincible predator. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or further extensions. The massive manhunt in California. The call came in just before dawn. Detective Frank Walters was halfway through his third cup of coffee when his phone buzzed. He answered, expecting the usual dead-end tip or routine follow-up. He was wrong. Frank, said Captain Neal on the other line, sounding unusually urgent. We've got something. Traffic cams near Bakersfield picked up the tricked-out silver pickup, the one that flagged from Amarillo last week. It's heading west, likely toward L.A. Walters sat up, the sleepiness evaporating from his face. Are you sure it's him? Not entirely, Neal admitted, but it matches the vehicle description. The pattern fits. He's sticking to truck stops and avoids main arteries until he has to hit town centers. We've got teams tracking him, but this could be the closest we've ever been. I'm on it, Walters said, already grabbing his coat. He turned to Sandra Miller, who shuffled into the precinct looking like she'd barely slept. Get your bag, Sandra, we're going to California, now. The jet roared to life as they touched down at LAX, already briefed on the situation by local authorities. Walters and Miller drove straight to the makeshift command center, a converted RV parked near a rest area off I-5. FBI agents, highway patrol officers, and local detectives scurried about, talking through radios and scanning maps. The tracker feed from the traffic cameras glowed on a monitor in the corner. Who's running this thing? Walters barked the moment they stepped in. A tall, lean agent in his early 40s approached, his tight jaw making it clear he wasn't thrilled about sharing his jurisdiction. He extended his hand reluctantly. Agent Mason, he said curtly. We've been covering the West Coast angle of your case for months now. My team picked him up just outside Bakersfield. He slipped off I-5 at a truck stop 3 hours ago. We're flanking him as we speak. You've got surveillance in place? Miller interjected. Mason nodded grimly. Unmarked unit caught him on camera fueling up and grabbing snacks, but once he got back on the road, he took an entryway headed toward the Angeles National Forest. Let me guess, no cameras in the woods. Walters muttered, rubbing his temples. Bingo, Mason replied. The next 48 hours were a fever dream of tension. Slow, deliberate sweeps of the Angeles National Forest began, with law enforcement combing the dirt roads and secluded campgrounds where the suspect might be hiding. Walters sat in the back of an SUV scrolling through the digital footprint of victims connected to the trail. He's stalling, Walters muttered. Miller looked at him sharply. You think he knows we're tracking him? Walters nodded. Absolutely. He could have gassed it straight to LA, easily blended into the chaos of the city, but he didn't. He's leading us somewhere quiet. He likes control. We know that about him. He's not dumb enough to be holed up in a cabin this time, is he? Miller asked as she scanned the map pinned to the SUV's dashboard. Maybe he wants us to think that, Walters replied. On the third morning the break finally came. A drone equipped with thermal imaging picked up heat signatures near an abandoned ranger station deep in the forest. The team convened rapidly at the base camp before heading out. All right, let's get one thing straight, Mason said to the assembled officers. If it's him, this guy's proven he's not afraid to kill, and he's damn good at covering his tracks. We proceed cautiously. No lone cowboys, no getting sloppy. Walters adjusted his holster. Don't worry, Agent Mason. Nobody here's looking to be a hero. We just want the bastard in cuffs. The convoy of squad cars and tactical units moved silently through the dense forest road. Dust rose behind the vehicles, swirling into the early morning light as they crept closer to the ranger station. When they arrived, the scene was eerie. The station itself was partially collapsed, vines crawling up the wooden posts. A rusted sign reading, Angeles South Ranger Station S 1964, hung askew next to the entrance. The team dismounted, weapons raised. Helicopters above provided aerial coverage as officers spread out in teams of 2 to clear the area. Walters and Miller's breaths were steady, their every step cautious as they approached one of the station's side structures. Sandra, Walters whispered, motioning to a window. You see that? Miller squinted. Inside, behind broken shutters, was the unmistakable glint of metal. A table? No, tools. A knife glinted under the sliver of sunlight streaming in. It's him, Miller muttered. Suddenly Mason's voice crackled through the radio. We've got movement on the east side, someone's running. Walters and Miller bolted toward the noise, their boots crunching on the gravel path. Ahead, a tall figure darted between trees wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. A split second later, gunfire rang out. Hold your fire! Mason barked over comms. Hold your goddamn fire! We need him alive! Walters ran with everything he had, his adrenaline coursing. The suspect was faster than they expected, weaving nimbly between the dense trees. He's heading toward the cliffs, an officer shouted. Cut him off! Flank left! Walters barked. It was Miller who spotted him first. The suspect had stopped just short of a steep ridge overlooking the valley below. Chest heaving, knife glinting in his right hand, he turned to face them, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. Drop it! Miller yelled, gun drawn. It's over! The man smirked, his hood falling back to reveal gaunt cheeks and piercing, predator-like eyes. You think this stops here? His voice was calm, almost amused. You think you've won? Walters stepped forward, his own weapon trained on the suspect. We're not here to debate, pal. Drop the knife, or I swear to God. Before Walters could finish, the suspect took one step backward. Miller's heart dropped as she realized what he was doing. No! She shouted. Too late. The man hurled himself over the ridge, disappearing into the treetops below. The sound of crashing foliage echoed through the canyon as officers rushed to the edge, trying in vain to spot him. Hours later, as the scene calmed and search teams began scouring the valley, Walters and Miller leaned wearily against their SUV. We had him, Walters said bitterly, staring into the horizon. Miller shook her head. The way he smiled, he wanted this, Frank. He wanted us to chase him out here. He wanted us to see him jump and disappear again. You think he's dead? Walters murmured, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. Miller didn't answer. Deep down, neither of them believed it. Back at the command center later that night, Mason approached them, running a hand through his hair. We've searched the entire valley, he said grimly. No body, no blood trail, nothing. Walters crushed the cigarette butt under his boot. Then it's not over, not even close. And as they stared at the map once again, piecing together the next possible route, one thing became clear. The highway killer was still out there, and his game was far from finished. This expanded tale is designed to bring every beat of tension alive, showcasing the intensity of the hunt, the near capture, and the psychological battle between the detectives and the elusive killer. Let me know if you'd like to extend or add further twist. The terrifying confession from Jackson Reed. The gray-walled interrogation room at the Houston FBI field office was cold, sterile, and purposefully barren to unsettle its occupant. A single metal table separated Jackson Reed from the two detectives watching him intently from across the room. Reed sat there calm, smug even, his lanky frame sprawled casually in the chair like he had nowhere else to be. His sharp green eyes darted across the room, taking everything in, the flickering fluorescent light, the security camera in the corner, the beads of sweat forming on Detective Frank Walters' brow. Reed smirked. "You guys always keep it this cold?" His voice was low, gravelly, and carried the unmistakable inflection of someone who might enjoy a joke just as much as gruesome violence. "Take it as an incentive to start talking," Walters snapped, leaning forward. He was tired, hungry, and burned out from the months of chasing this phantom of a killer. Now here the bastard was, sitting just a few feet away, and he had the audacity to relax like it was just another uneventful Tuesday. "Talking?" Reed's smirk widened, his tone dripping with mockery. "I'm here. That's more than you could say about your other suspects, huh? The ones who weren't me?" He cocked his head, a faint trace of amusement lighting his features. "I mean, come on, admit it, detective. You thought you'd never catch me." Beside Walters, Detective Sandra Miller tried to keep her cool, but even her professional veneer showed signs of cracking. "This isn't a game, Reed," she said, her voice razor-sharp. "You know why you're here." Reed leaned back, letting his lips curl into something almost resembling a grin. "Do I? Enlighten me." Miller slammed a stack of crime scene photos onto the metal table in front of him. The images fanned out like gruesome playing cards, blood-smeared motel rooms, bound victims, lifeless bodies staged with clinical precision. "These!" she hissed, her eyes locking with his. 14 people, you did this!" Reed's grin didn't falter. If anything, it grew darker, more predatory. He glanced at the photos, his eyes lingering on one in particular. "That one was my favorite," he said softly, nodding toward the picture of Richard Walker, the first recorded victim. His tone was eerily casual, as if he were recalling a pleasant memory. Walters pounded a fist on the table, his patience finally snapping. "Don't you dare sit there like you're proud of what you've done. These were human lives." Reed didn't flinch. Instead, he kept his gaze steady, his tone still maddeningly calm. "Human lives," he echoed. "Sure, that's one way to look at it, but you see, Frank—" "Can I call you Frank?" He didn't wait for an answer. "People like you always try to make it personal. You give them names, histories, families, dreams. I see people for what they really are. Meat, routine, predictable. You're like ants crawling around on a giant map, clueless about who's watching and what they want." Miller felt a shiver run down her spine. "And what did you want, Jackson?" she asked, forcing the question through clenched teeth. "Why did you do it?" "Now that," Reed said, leaning forward with mock seriousness, "is a fascinating question, Detective Sandra Miller." His voice grew quieter, almost intimate. "Did I do it because I hated them? No. Did I do it because I needed money? That's laughable. Honestly, I did it because I could." Walters stared at him, his face a mask of disgust. "Because you could?" Reed shrugged. "It's not like anyone was going to stop me. Think about it. I gave you clowns a 2-year head start. 2 years. And while you stumbled around chasing your tails, I was busy." He motioned lazily toward another photo on the table as though admiring a piece of art. "And what exactly were you so busy with?" Walters growled, though he feared the answer. Reed's grin returned, this time tinged with something far more sinister. "Perfecting my craft. See, the first one, Walker? He was crude. Too much sloppiness back then. But by the time I got to Flagstaff, I'd hit my stride. The clean edges, the absolute control. It's an art, really. But of course not everyone can appreciate a masterpiece." Miller felt bile rise in her throat. "You're sick," she spat. "A psychopath who—" "Psychopath, sociopath," Reed interrupted, waving her off. "Labels are boring. I prefer visionary. Picture this, a map of the country, highways crisscrossing like veins in a body. And I am the scalpel. Precise. Cutting out the pieces I no longer want to see." Fury flared in Walter's eyes. He slammed his fist on the table again, his booming voice echoing off the walls. "Enough with the metaphors, you monster! Admit to every single one of them, every life you snuffed out." Reed held up his hands mockingly, pretending to surrender. Fine, you win, Frank. You want a confession? Okay, I did it," he said nonchalantly. "All of it. The motels, the cabins, the truck stops, Richard Walker, Alicia Parker, Caitlin Rhodes. I could list all their names, but that would take forever, and let's face it, I've got other plans today. You're not going anywhere, Walters hissed. Reed tilted his head, his smile unwavering. You really think putting me in a box stops the game? People like me, Detective, we don't just end. You might take me off the board, sure, but there are others out there watching, learning, and they'll carry the torch. See, what I've done isn't just a string of crimes, it's art. They'll imitate it, they'll expand it. Miller's fists tightened as she fought to keep her composure. What you've done is destroy people, families, lives. Reed's expression darkened, the smile fading just slightly. Families, he echoed softly. For a moment a fleeting trace of something resembling emotion flickered in his eyes, anger, maybe, or sorrow, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Don't lecture me about families, Detective, you wouldn't understand. Walters leaned in, catching the subtle shift in Reed's tone. What about your family, Jackson? Is that what this is really about? Reed's jaw tightened, his composure cracking for just a second, his eyes flared with something raw, something human, but then, just as quickly, the mask snapped back into place. He grinned once more, leaning back in his chair. Nice try, Frank, but you're not gonna dig into my soul and find a sad little boy crying for mommy and daddy. That's not why I'm here. I'm here because I wanted to be. The room hung in heavy silence. Walters and Miller exchanged a glance, both of them realizing the weight of every chilling word Reed had spoken. You wanted to get caught, Miller said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Think of it like the curtain call after a brilliant performance, Reed said, spreading his arms theatrically. You can only run for so long before the audience deserves a finale, so, here I am. Enjoy the show. This extended version delves deeper into the twisted, manipulative psyche of Jackson Reed and furthers the palpable tension between him and his interrogators. Let me know if you'd like a continuation or adjustment. The final sentence and the big lesson. It was a sweltering day in June 2002 when Jackson Reed was led into the Harris County Courthouse. The media frenzy had turned the once serene grounds outside into a cacophony of reporters, spectators, and protesters, all gathered to witness the endgame of one of the most gruesome and notorious trials in recent history. Inside, the marble hallways hummed with hushed anticipation. The courtroom was packed to its rafters. Family members of the victims sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mosaic of grief and righteous anger. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and the defense team sat stiff, resigned, as though they knew the outcome had been sealed long before. Detectives Frank Walters and Sandra Miller watched quietly from the back pew. After years of chasing Reed across highways, through forests, and into the cesspools of his twisted psyche, this was their moment to see the man brought to justice. Yet, despite the day's importance, there was no triumph in either of their faces. Only exhaustion etched into their features. "This is it, huh?" Miller murmured, her arms crossed tightly. "Yeah," Walters replied without looking at her, his eyes fixed on Reed as he was seated at the defense table. "Doesn't feel as good as I thought it would, though," Miller sighed. "It never does. Even when you win, you lose." The trial had dragged on for weeks, but the sentencing portion was over in just 2 days. Reed's guilt was beyond question. The overwhelming physical evidence, his fake IDs, the survivor Lisa Brown's harrowing testimony, and, worst of all, Reed's own gleeful confession spelled out a fate no jury could ignore. Today the jury's foreman, a middle-aged man with glasses who looked like he hadn't slept in days, stood up, cleared his throat, and read the words out loud. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Jackson Reed, guilty. On the recommendation of sentencing, the jury unanimously votes for the death penalty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, muffled by a few sobs from families in the gallery. Walters glanced at Miller, who clenched her jaw but didn't speak. She'd read the outcome on every jury member's face long before it was announced. Jackson Reed, meanwhile, didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still in his chair, his smirk long gone, his eerie green eyes fixed somewhere above the judge's head, as if surveying the clouds beyond the courthouse windows. "This court hereby sentences the defendant to death by lethal injection," Judge Carter announced, her voice clear and resolute. "This sentence will be carried out at the earliest opportunity under the laws of the state of Texas." For a few seconds there was no sound except the distant murmurs of the press outside. Then a shrill voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "Rot in hell!" yelled the sister of Alicia Parker, one of Reed's victims. Her cry shattered the room's solemnity. pulling everyone out of their collective trance. Reed slowly turned his head toward the noise, his lips curling in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Later that afternoon, as the crowds began to disperse, Walters and Miller stood outside the courthouse steps, watching the press swarm around the families. TV anchors shouted into microphones while news vans idled along the curb. "What happens now?" Miller asked, her face shadowed with uncertainty. Walters lit a cigarette and took a slow drag, staring out into the chaos. "Now? Now those families go home and they try to figure out how to live with this, and us? We go back to work." Sandra turned to look at him, her brow furrowed. "You think those families feel like there's justice today?" Walters exhaled a stream of smoke, his gaze hard. "Justice? Sure. But closure? That's a different beast entirely." Miller nodded quietly, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. Reed was finally off the streets, but his crimes had left echoes, grief-ridden families, lingering doubts, and the terrifying revelation that monsters like him could walk among anyone. The lessons from Reed's case weren't just about the blood he spilled. They were about the cracks in the system that allowed him to thrive. For nearly 2 years, Reed had slipped through the cracks, switching identities, manipulating small-town motel owners, preying on the forgotten and the transient, all while reveling in his freedom. Agent Victoria Hayes from the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit had summarized it best during a post-trial press conference. Jackson Reed exploited the highways of America, the vast stretches of rural unsupervised space that too often go unnoticed. This case isn't just about one man's trail of terror. It's about a system that allowed him to stay invisible for so long. We need to ensure it never happens again. But ensuring it didn't happen again was easier said than done. A month later, Walters stood over his desk at the precinct, staring at the map they used to track Reed's movements. The red pins were still dotted along endless highways across Texas, Louisiana, and beyond. Reed was incarcerated, alone in a tiny cell awaiting his sentence, but the map felt unfinished. Miller walked in, her coffee steaming in one hand and a manila folder tucked under her arm. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're not actually thinking about connecting those pins again, are you?" Walters didn't look up. "Just feels like there's more out there." "More how?" "You saw the Flagstaff case. That family wasn't part of his plan. He didn't just wake up one day and decide to hunt groups. What if there was someone else? A partner? Or worse, a copycat already learning from the trail he left?" Miller set her coffee down hard on the desk. "Come on, Frank. Don't go down that rabbit hole. The man's been caught. He's done. We have to move on." Walters leaned back and gave her a searching look. "Move on? You know as well as I do that he wasn't just trying to kill people. He was trying to teach somebody, to pass the torch." "He's on death row, Frank," she said, her tone clipped but uneasy. "That torch doesn't go anywhere." But deep down, neither of them could ignore the unease that Reed had planted in their minds, the wild card no one talks about until it's too late. 3 years later, on a cold December night in 2005, Jackson Reed was strapped to the gurney at Huntsville Penitentiary. As the drugs began coursing through his veins, he offered one final statement, spoken in that same low, gravelly tone that had haunted Walters and Miller for years. "You think this ends with me? It doesn't. I wasn't the first, and I won't be the last." Those words hung heavy in the sterile chamber long after his heart monitor flatlined. And back in Texas, as news of his execution spread, Walters found himself standing before the same map, a fresh cigarette in his hand. He stared at the red pins, wondering if they'd ever stop multiplying. This extended section dives into the emotional aftermath, the societal impact of Reed's case, and the lingering questions that haunt law enforcement even after they win. It highlights not only the punishment, but also the lessons and the paranoia Reed left behind. Let me know if you need this tweaked or even layered further. The pieces that never fit together. The soft hum of the midnight air conditioning filled the precinct as Detective Frank Walters leaned against the edge of his desk, staring at the sprawling map pinned to the wall. The red pins, bright against the faded highways they marked, seemed to mock him. These weren't just locations, they were tragedies, each one representing a life lost. And though Jackson Reed was gone, though his heart had flatlined in a sterile chamber 3 years ago, the map still didn't feel finished. Beside the map, a sheet of old crime scene photos swayed lightly under the ceiling fan. Familiar but haunting images stared back at him. Motel rooms with blood-streaked carpets, broken door locks, lifeless scenes frozen in time. Walters lit a cigarette, his tired eyes fixed on a blank stretch of highway between Texas and New Mexico where no pins rested. Sandra Miller entered quietly, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She'd traded late nights in the field for days at a desk since Jackson Reed's execution, but something about this particular night had made her stop by without warning. Her sharp eyes caught the glow of the desk lamp and the far-off look in Walter's expression. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, crossing her arms as she walked closer. Walters didn't answer right away, just exhaled a steady stream of smoke and nodded toward the map. "You ever feel like we got it wrong?" Miller raised an eyebrow, leaning on the desk across from him. "Frank, we nailed him. If you need me to rerun the evidence for the 100th time, I will. Jackson Reed was the damn guy. He's gone. He's not out there anymore." "That's not what I mean," Walters muttered, tapping the cigarette against the ashtray. He pointed at one of the pins near Flagstaff. "The family at the cabin. He wasn't supposed to hit groups, right? That wasn't his style. Too loud, too risky." "Right," Miller agreed, though she didn't like where he was going with this. "And the timing," Walters continued. 3 weeks before that family, there was the body dumped outside Albuquerque, no fingerprints, no IDs, not even Reed's usual knot work. Yet we connected it to him. Why? Because it fit the geography and we had nothing else to go on. "Frank," Miller sighed, her voice heavy now. "We've had this conversation." "And I still don't buy it," he interrupted, his voice growing sharper. "What if that wasn't him? What if we missed something? Or worse, what if there was someone else?" Miller stiffened. It wasn't the first time Walters had voiced his lingering doubts about the case, but tonight he seemed sharper, more agitated. She folded her arms tighter. "Someone else?" she repeated. Walters nodded, stepping closer to the map. His finger traced the highway route spiraling out across the country. For 2 years Reed operated like a ghost, barely left a trail, no mistakes, no noise, and yet right before or after some of the murders we tied to him, there were other bodies. Similar crimes, but never quite right. Either too messy or too clean. Stabbings when he'd usually strangle. Strangulations when he'd use a blade. You don't find that strange? Miller hesitated. She had felt those same twinges of doubt during the investigation, but when they'd caught Reed, when he'd so gleefully admitted to the killings, it felt easier to silence those thoughts. After all, wasn't the end result what mattered? Reed could have been experimenting, evolving his methods. She forced herself to stay rational. "You're saying what?" Miller asked finally, meeting his eyes. "That someone else was following him, copying him? Frank, that's a bit far-fetched, don't you think?" Walters scoffed. "You counsel me all the time on not ignoring coincidences, so explain this to me. Why did Reed suddenly change his pattern before we even got close to catching him? Why, after 2 years of solo travelers and transient loners, did he suddenly start targeting families, leaving behind sloppier scenes? And what about the files the Vegas PD sent us last week?" Miller blinked. "Vegas?" He grabbed a folder from his desk and tossed it to her. Inside was a stack of reports, mostly on unsolved homicides at budget motels around the outskirts of Las Vegas, California, and Nevada truck stops. Miller's fingers paused on a photo of a woman found tied to a bed, her throat slashed in a clean, calculated strike. The date was 4 months after Reed had been executed. Miller frowned. It's not him, it can't be him. Reed was dead by then." "My point exactly," Walters said, tapping the photo. "It wasn't him, but it sure as hell looks like someone wanted it to be." For a long time Miller didn't say anything. It was hard for her as a logical investigator to entertain Walters' implication, that Reed might have been part of something bigger, that someone else might have been mimicking his work, or that a fragment of his malevolent legacy had lived on in someone else's hands. "You think it's a copycat?" she asked slowly, almost reluctantly. Walters shrugged, as if he didn't even trust his own theory. "Or maybe a partner, someone who was watching him or helping him all along, someone who learned from him." "Frank, Reed was a loner. We both saw the psychological profile," Miller protested. But even as she said it, her voice wavered. "We saw the profile," Walters countered. "Profiles aren't perfect. What if he wasn't working alone? What if all those IDs we couldn't trace, all those aliases, what if someone else was cleaning up after him or learning from him?" The room fell quiet except for the soft tapping of the ash falling from Walters' cigarette. For the first time in years Miller began to feel the same creeping unease that had clung to the early days of the Reed manhunt. Miller's voice dropped. "So, what do we do, Frank? Reopen the case? Chase ghosts?" Walters shook his head. "No, it's not about opening old wounds. But we don't ignore what's right in front of us. Vegas, Flagstaff, Albuquerque. Something doesn't sit right. Someone out there knows we stopped Jackson Reed, and maybe, just maybe, they think it's their turn now. You really think we're gonna see someone take his place? Miller asked, her tone grim. Walters extinguished his cigarette and let out a long breath. There are no perfect monsters, Sandra, but people like Jackson Reed, they leave scars on the world, and scars always draw attention from the wrong kind of people. 3 weeks after that late-night conversation, a report arrived on Walter's desk. Another motel murder, this time in Denver. Miller glanced at the file when she walked by, her chest tightening as her eyes darted over the report. It was the same as before: transient victim, truck stop location, clean kill. You think it's him? Miller said softly, not really phrasing it as a question. No, Walters replied, his voice tired but resolute. But I think whoever it is, they're just getting warmed up. This expanded version dives deep into the lingering paranoia after Jackson Reed's case, exploring the unresolved fears of copycats, accomplices, or a darker truth behind his legacy. It examines the psychological aftermath of stopping one killer, but sensing that the nightmare isn't over. Let me know if you'd like to delve even deeper.